The subcommittees will come to order. We will start with our opening statements. Our good friends on the other side are still caucusing, and we've tried to wait as long as possible. But when Mr. Meadows said that he was leaving, that was it. We said, we've got to start. Time is of the essence. So we will do a little bit of business and hear from our witness. Thank you. And then we'll wait for our colleagues to come back. So after recognizing myself, and when they come in, Ranking Member Deutsch and Ranking Member Keating for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute, but we will start with that process now. We will then hear from our witness, and without objection, the witness's prepared statements will be made a part of the record. Members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. And before beginning my opening statement, I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge the other chairman of this joint subcommittee hearing, Judge Poe, who could not be with us this morning as he continues to undergo treatment for leukemia. And I know that all of our thoughts and prayers are with Judge Poe as he fights this disease, and we wish him the best. And I have his opening statement, and without objection, it will be made a part of the record now. The chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. December 17th marks the one-year anniversary of the Libyan political agreement, making this an opportune time to review the administration's policy on Libya. While this administration first participated in the intervention in Libya in 2011, many of us expressed concern with the administration's lack of clearly articulated objectives, a post-intervention plan, and even an explanation about how it fit U.S. national security interests. Many of our worst fears have come to fruition, as more than 5 years after Ghadafi's death, Libya is embroiled in a difficult civil war that shows no sign of abatement. If anything, it has only gotten worse since the UN brokered agreement. Libya is more politically divided than ever. Its economy is in a free fall. Terrorist groups and criminals continue to exploit the power vacuum. Multiple governing entities and their allied militias and armed forces compete for power, while the UN-backed unity government, known as the Government of National Accord, remains unable to provide basic security and basic services to the people of Libya. Criminals and terrorist groups, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so many others, take advantage of the chaos, securing their own territory and using Libya as a launching pad for smuggling, for human trafficking, for terror attacks, endangering Libya's neighbors, such as Egypt and Tunisia. Libya is now the main transit point for migrants trying to reach Europe. And with little border security or governance, many are rightly concerned by the potential of terrorists reaching our own shores. While reports say that forces are close to retaking Sirte from ISIS, we should not allow this news to disguise the sad reality. ISIS' presence in Libya is far from being eliminated. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Ansar al-Sharia, the group responsible for the 2012 Benghazi attack, as well as others, all continue to maintain cells throughout the country. In a positive development, I was relieved to see the announcement last month that the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons was able to remove Libya's remaining chemical weapons equipment. Another welcome development, if accurate, is the reported killing by French airstrikes of the Algerian jihadist known as the One-Eyed Terrorist. He is said to have been responsible for organizing terrorist attacks in Libya, Algeria, and Mali, so many other places, and had funneled millions of dollars to Al-Qaeda. France's airstrikes highlight the stakes that many outside actors have in Libya. Russia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others continue to support Khalifa Haftar, the former Libyan National Army general, bless you, who recently claimed victory in Benghazi and who was just in Moscow discussing Russian military assistance. Reports indicate that at least 4 countries have special forces on the ground in Libya right now, including our own, and in some cases are assisting forces on both sides of Libya's civil war. It is also worth noting that in recent months, Haftar has seized many of the ports in Libya's oil crescent, which is Libya's main source of revenue. With additional violence on the horizon, potentially between Eastern and Western forces, Haftar's role must be addressed in Libya's political dialogue, a dialogue that should come sooner rather than later. Since the unity government took up residence in Tripoli in March, it has struggled to provide the kind of basic services and security that could engender the support that it needs in order to consolidate power. And as long as it keeps struggling in the West while its rival governing entities and security forces keep operating and making gains in the East, any chance that the current peace process had at succeeding will continue to be undermined. As we approach the one-year anniversary of the Libyan political agreement, it is clear that the status quo in Libya is unsustainable and that there must be a new and revitalized attempt at reconciling all Libyan stakeholders. I look forward to hearing from our witness on exactly how the administration is working to help get that peace process back on track, the status of our counterterrorism operation against ISIS and others, and what kind of changes to our Libya policy and assistance we should expect moving forward. And I'm now pleased to yield to members for their opening statements. I will turn to Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this important hearing. And despite Libya's obvious geopolitical importance, it's really not received the public attention that it deserves. President Obama has called his administration's failure to adequately plan for a post-Ghadafi Libya the worst mistake of his presidency. And the word mistake really doesn't begin to capture the situation in Libya, which is a catastrophic failure. Back in August of 2012, I spent the better part of a day and a half with Ambassador Stevens in Tripoli. This was about a month before he was brutally murdered along with 3 other brave Americans. And of course, the administration misled the American people at that time by saying that this was caused by some video. And we also later learned that Ambassador Stevens and his people had sought help and better security and more protection, and that they were basically ignored by their higher-ups in the State Department. Libya is now engulfed in not one but 2 civil wars. The chaos has spread to Mali, and now both countries have become safe havens for al-Qaeda and ISIS. When the so-called Arab Spring spread to Libya in 2011, we were told a military intervention to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi was essential to our national security. We were told by the Obama administration that we could, in effect, lead from behind, and the cost of intervention would largely be borne by our allies. And finally, we were told Libya could easily be rebuilt and stabilized basically on the cheap. As it turns out, none of these things were true, and I eagerly await the administration's views on these things and many others that will question them. And thank you again for holding this hearing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabbat. Do any members wish to make an opening statement? If not, let me introduce our witness. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Jonathan Weiner, who serves as the State Department's Special Envoy for Libya, as well as Senior Advisor for MEK Resettlement. Thank you for your work on that. He was previously the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement. We welcome you to our subcommittee, and for the record, Chairman Poe and I invited DOD officials to testify at our hearing, but the Department of Defense failed to respond to our invitation, did not offer a witness. So we thank you for being here, sir, and we will turn to you for your opening statement, Mr. Weiner.
You're welcome, Madam Chairman. Chairman Ros-Lehtinen.
If you could put that microphone a little bit closer.
Sure. Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Deutsch, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the committees. I'm honored by the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss U.S. foreign policy on Libya. Thank you. During my service as Special Envoy for Libya, our policy is centered on promoting the ability of Libyans to maintain a stable, unified, and inclusive government that can both defeat ISIL and other terrorist groups and simultaneously meet the security, economic, and humanitarian needs of the Libyan people. After 42 years of Muammar Gaddafi's erratic rule and 5 years since the country cast off his shackles, Libya has made some, but not enough progress in reaching these goals. Libya's post-Gaddafi institutions have not provided sufficient stability and opportunity for the Libyan people, but they have made some visible progress against terrorism. And they still have an opportunity to move forward in securing a more functional national transitional government. Libya needs to move forward on both goals. Neither objective is sustainable without the other. Since the signing of the Libyan political agreement in Skhirat, Morocco on December 17, 2015, the Government of National Accord, or GNA, led by Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj, has been a steadfast partner of the United States and the international community against ISIL. A year ago, before the Skhirat Agreement, ISIL was expanding its presence in Libya, capturing 90 miles of prime Mediterranean coastline around the coastal city of Sirte, a stone's throw away from Europe's southern shores. A year later, the picture looks very different. Now, due to the bravery of GNA-aligned Libyan soldiers, supported since this summer by the skill of U.S. forces, who have conducted more than 450 airstrikes coordinated with our Libyan partners, ISIL controls just a few city blocks in Sirte, and its grasp on even this sliver of Libyan territory is tenuous. In Benghazi and in Libya's east, this has been, ISIL and other terrorist groups in other parts of Libya have also been pushed back. In Benghazi and in Libya's east, this has been due to sustained efforts by equally brave Libyan soldiers. So we've seen Libyan soldiers in different parts of the country and with different political orientations taking on terrorism in different parts of Libya. And what was a substantial presence of ISIL in terms of its control of territory in Libya is now all but eliminated. The gains against ISIL are real, but they could also be reversible if Libyans do not come together to participate in the GNA and to help it perform its work for the Libyan people and to unify against the common threat to all. This is true today for the transitional GNA. It will be true for the next Libyan government that's formed after the country moves ahead with elections sometime next year or in early 2018. If Libyans choose to fight each other instead of uniting, they risk increasing the probability that ISIL and other violent extremists in its mold will be back. Accordingly, we're continuing our work seeking to broaden support for a common political path forward to build a more capable government and to unify and professionalize Libya's armed forces. We see no military solution to Libya's political divisions. Sustainable security solutions require sustainable political solutions. We also need to keep working with Libyans on getting oil flowing and stabilizing its economy. If Libya can get back to producing even 1 million barrels a day out of its previous 1.6 million barrel per day capacity, it could easily provide the Libyan people the funds they need for food, health care, education, and other basic needs. Sustainable economic success, too, requires sustainable political solutions. Continuing intensive mediation to ensure the political process moves forward will be critical. Libyans will continue to look to the U.S. for our help as the GNA moves forward in addressing these challenges, and we must be prepared to give it. Ms. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee, the U.S. government remains deeply engaged in Libya. We have shared national security interests in defeating ISIL. The U.S. supports the aspirations of the Libyan people for a united, inclusive, and responsive national government capable of overcoming the country's significant challenges and political divisions. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Weiner. Ms. Ros-Lehtinen had to go. I'm filling in for it this time, so I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Her first question would have been, and I'll answer or ask that at this time. Please describe the various violent Islamist, extremist, and terrorist groups currently operating in Libya. Who are they? How many fighters does each group have? What are their goals? And anything else that you'd like to add that you think would be relevant and helpful for this committee to understand? Sure.
There are 4 major groups that are UN-designated terrorist groups that we pay attention to. It's surely not the entire complete list, because there are local groups with different places in the spectrum of extremism who are present in the environment as well, who we have to pay attention to, and Libyans have to pay attention to. Some of them are purely domestic, and I would distinguish those from the ones that operate in a transnational way. But the four groups are Islamic State. I've seen different numbers from the United States government on how many are present. Prior to the offensive, the range in estimates were 3,000 to 6,500. I've seen numbers that many. Hundreds of Islamic State fighters have been killed in the CERT fighting. Hundreds. Difficult to get an exact number, but it's in that range. What are the numbers today? I don't think anyone knows. I would suspect they're at the lower end of that spectrum, but there you need to get briefings in closed session from people who are responsible for making those kinds of assessments. In addition to Daesh, you have al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, which maintains an independent presence. They have been present in Benghazi, though at this point they're down to a sliver, a tiny sliver of territory in Benghazi. They've been basically eliminated there. And it's not clear how much longer they'll hold the last block or two where they still have a presence. There's likely al-Qaeda cells elsewhere in the country. There have been a couple of different groups calling themselves Ansar al-Sharia. One has been present in Derna in the Far East. Another has been present in the far west of Libya, sometimes called Ansar al-Sharia Tunis. They have been responsible in significant part for attacks in Tunisia at the Bardo Museum and at the Sousse or Sousse Beach area. So that's a third group. A fourth group, Al-Marabatoon, is present to some extent in Libya. They have been Algerian-based originally, and they move around within countries to the west and south of Libya as well. Those are the principal four groups. Beyond that, you get into constellations of militias with different types of ties, some of whom disagree with and fight other Libyan militias and other Libyan military forces. And that gets more complicated pretty quickly. And the situation in Benghazi has been made complicated by the presence of some of those groups, along with people who are clearly Islamic State and people who are al-Qaeda in the Maghreb.
Thank you very much. My next question is this. There was a significant amount of criticism of the Bush administration for inadequately planning, shall we say, after the overthrow of Saddam in Iraq. Even after all that criticism, why did this administration fail to perhaps learn from that? And I think most people would agree there was a lack of planning for the power transition after Ghadafi and the situation that we have today. How could that happen, and what can we learn in the future to avoid that type of thing from future administrations, including the current one, the next administration, which will be coming in about 2 months?
Mr. Chabot, it's an absolutely excellent core question, and it's a question that deserves a lot of thought. I'll do the best I can extemporaneously to respond. In both Iraq and in Libya, you had dictatorships that had been in place for a very long time. And when you have dictatorships, they tend to have live in a bubble and not to have good political feedback mechanisms, to have institutions function in ways other than by the command of the dictator. So in both cases, the institutions that were left following the military actions did not function in the absence of the authoritarian leader telling everybody what to do. They probably did not function tremendously well previously, but they certainly functioned very terribly afterward. So I think there needs to be a recognition anytime one goes after a dictator that the societies that the dictators have led for decades are going to have underdeveloped political institutions. In the case of Libya, there are technocratic institutions that functioned very well under Gaddafi and have functioned well since. The National Oil Corporation functioned very well to get oil pumped and to keep track of oil and to handle all elements of Libyan oil production. Central bank, technically, capable of functioning to move money for people for salaries, to be able to follow budgets and make payments in that way similarly, and to operate as other central banks do. The National Telecommunications and Postal Service, same kind of technical capacity. But political institutions, not so much. In politics, you have different people whose view is, I'm the one who should decide, not that gentleman or woman over there, and no accepted, agreed-upon mechanism for power sharing. So there's been disagreements pretty much nonstop on how to share power, how to deliver services at the local level, how to make the key decisions to move ahead. Constant negotiations and efforts to get alignment among the different geographies, geographical regions, the different tribes, the different cities, as well as the different political parties and ideologies. So it has made for a very, very difficult transition for Libya, as it did for Iraq. So I think any time one is going to engage in trying to undertake an intervention in another country, you have to do so with a lot of humility, with an appreciation of risk and of uncertainty, and with constant review before, while you're doing it, and afterward, to be able to correct course as you go. You also need alignment from neighbors, because if you have neighbors with different visions on the future engaging in a country, different regional players, for example, you can wind up with different domestic groups being backed by different regional forces, and thereby believing that they're going to be victorious as a result of having their patron. So it has been critical, in the case of Libya, to try and get regional players aligned with one another in support of a joint and unified solution, and that's what we've been working on.
Thank you. My time's expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Cook, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. By the way, thank you very much for your patience with everything that's going on today. And I wanted to just get your thoughts on the relationship with Egypt and the LCC government. A number of years ago, going way back, you know, the relationship with Libya and Egypt was strained, to say the least. Could you view that? I know that Egypt is concerned with the Sinai and its own economic development, but it would seem that Egypt could have a tremendous influence in that region there, going back to historic times, and whether you had any comments or thoughts on that.
Sure. Egypt is a tremendously important actor in relationship to Libya. It has a long shared border, long shared history, and Egyptian officials very much want to see a stable and secure Libya. The question for the United States, as we work closely with Egypt, we work closely with literally all of Libya's neighbors across the Mediterranean as well as on land, and with other regional players, is what is going to produce stability and security for the long term. As I mentioned in my testimony, we're convinced that you have to have a viable national government as well as a viable national security forces working together in a way that is sustainable. That means a government that is inclusive. It can't just be a government from the East or representing Easterners, for example. It has to include people from Misrata, people from Tripoli, people from the South. The United States and Egypt talk about Libya all the time. I've been to Cairo I don't know how many times in recent months, meeting with very senior officials. And to date, we have been able to achieve alignment in supporting the Libyan political agreement, in a series of UN Security Council resolutions, and even on stopping flows of illicit oil when they've happened. We've had cooperation and integration. There are differences in perspective in some areas. Egypt wants to see a very strong Libyan army. We want to see a strong Libyan army too. I think our focus has been on how you get that integrated across the whole country in a way that is under civilian rule, civilian control, but also maintains the ability to do its job properly. And we continue to work with them on that.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantos, who I believe, didn't I hear that you just had an addition to your family?
That's right.
A little girl?
Nice little girl, bundle of joy.
Congratulations.
Oh, no, it's tremendous. Thank you so much. In terms of, you mentioned Ansar al-Sharia, they were widely regarded as perpetrating the Benghazi attacks. I know that the administration has indicted one individual from that. Has there been any other efforts made or actions taken to hold anyone else accountable who was involved with those attacks?
The FBI has active engagement in trying to bring the perpetrators of those attacks to justice. The Departments of State and every element of the Obama administration, whenever there is an opportunity to try and advance those investigations, we work away at it. One of the most important things to me as Special Envoy when we worked on the formation of the Government of National Accord was being able to talk to the new members of the Presidency Council about this case and to say how much it matters to us. They said it matters to us, Mr. Weiner, at least as much as it matters to you. Libyans loved Chris Stevens. They knew Ambassador Stevens very well. The other 3 victims of that attack also require and deserve justice, and the Libyans raise this issue with me when we're talking about other things. They want to see us back in the country, and they want to see this episode brought to a close with justice, and I've never heard any Libyan I've talked to take a different position. There's an emotional element to this that's important to the future of both countries, and I thank you for raising it.
And just judging by your response and mentioning the FBI, am I right to assume that the response is legal / investigatory rather than kinetic in conjunction with, say, the Department of Defense?
The FBI has had the lead on this issue since those attacks took place. I personally believe that if we have the ability to go after terrorists in Libya or anywhere who've been involved in the killing of Americans, that we should exercise that. In the case of Libya, this administration has done so on multiple occasions. In Libya, we went after and killed ISIL's emir, who was located at that time in the eastern half of Libya's coastal region. We went after a group of terrorists in western Libya, a very, very successful attack that killed a number of them. And we should be prepared to do that when it meets the objective test of people who are threatening Americans or have killed Americans.
Well, good. Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. I think that's true, and I think it's been a little frustrating with the Benghazi response, just simply because we had identified a group, and I view that very much as an act of war. The law enforcement component I get, but I think when that was done in the 90s, I think that probably wasn't as effective, and I certainly support the other strikes that you had mentioned. I think that those were absolutely justified. Let me ask you this: of the folks who are kind of on the ground in Libya, the various groups that the U.S. is working with, I mean, what are they seeking? Are they seeking just to put an end to a lot of the turmoil? Do they want a more democratic, pluralistic society? Do they want a more Islamic-based society where you would have a Sharia-type system? What would you say are kind of in the mix?
You're talking about the terrorist groups?
No, I'm talking about just groups that we're working with.
Oh, sure.
What are their orientations?
First, I think most Libyans want to see a stable, prosperous, secure Libya. They want good lives like people want any other country in the world. So most people in the first instance, that's what they want. It's getting there that's so hard, getting the leaders to negotiate with one another, compromise with one another, to create a unified government based on reconciliation that can build trust by performing. That's what most Libyans, I believe, want. And the many groups of Libyans, different Libyan leaders I talk to, profess to want the same thing. The Libyans that we're working with on the battle over Sirte did not like and did not want to be threatened by a foreign, brutal, repellent ideology and organization that was milking Libyan resources to accrete power and to stifle all alternatives. and they felt very strongly that that needed to be stopped. In Benghazi, prior to the Libyan National Army commanded by General Haftar coming in, there were assassinations in civil society that were really significantly affecting the ability of ordinary people to live. The goal is to get the forces that we have supported in the West, the forces that General Haftar has brought together in the East, and other forces, including those being put together in Tripoli now from people who used to work for the Libyan army in the past, together to form an integrated military that is non-ideological, that is technocratic, that is impartial and neutral, non-political, whose goal is to stabilize Libya and make the country safe for people to carry out their business and live normal, good lives in safety. A political agreement is going to be necessary to further political negotiations and discussions within the framework of the Scott Agreement is going to be necessary to get there, we believe. And we've been working on that intensively and will continue to.
So is that more of an Egyptian model then you're looking forward with how their military is operated through the years?
The gentleman's time has expired, but you can go ahead and answer the question.
Yes, sir. It is, I wouldn't call it an Egyptian model. It needs to be a Libyan model. Libyans will need to have, we believe, a joint defense leadership at the top in some way. There can be one person who's in the lead and others as part of it, but it's going to need to be joint because it needs to knit the country together. You know, Egypt has had a strong leadership out of Cairo for thousands of years, for a long, long time, out of one city. Long tradition in the 20th century of an Egyptian military. Libya has not. Libya has a more geographically diverse population, and it's going to need to be something that brings people together.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you being here, and sorry for the delay. You were talking about the flow of oil, the operation of it, the production and the sale operated well under Gaddafi. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
All right, and now it's kind of happenstance. It's not working as well.
What's happened in essence is that different Libyan factions have shut down oil production as a means of trying to get their way. You could call it extortion if you wanted to, in some cases, but essentially they've simply turned off the spigots. Libyan oil flows from fields to pipes to terminals.
Right.
So you can shut it off at the terminal, you can shut it off at the pipe, you can shut it off at the oil field.
And then you were talking about we need to have a viable national government, an inclusive government. Is that possible when you have a tribal mentality or a country with a tribal mentality versus a strong arm of a leader like a Gaddafi or a Hussein in Iraq? Is that possible in that kind of a country with that kind of mentality?
The aftermath of dictatorship is very hard on people almost anywhere it happens. In the case of Libya, Libyans need to come together to form a government that represents.
Well, that's what I'm asking. Is that possible? Because we've seen this story played out in
Sure.
Afghanistan, in Iraq, and what I see is America trying to correct the wrong from the no-fly zone that we know was a mistake, a terrible mistake, and we almost repeated this again in Syria. And here we are meddling, entangled in another Middle Eastern country with not a quick resolve. And I just want to see what your thoughts are on how do we get through this. And as a unity government, and I know that would be the ideal situation, but how feasible is that and how realistic is that?
I believe that Libyans don't like people from other countries telling them what to do.
I agree.
And they don't much like other Libyans telling them what to do. But they would rather be talking in the end, working things out among other Libyans, than having foreigners in charge. And one of the reasons the Islamic State has been pushed out of geographic control so quickly in the scheme of things is because Libyans, even the extremists in the east who invited them into Derna, started saying, we don't want them telling us what to do. We don't want those people out of Iraq, Syria telling us what to do. We're going to be extremists, we'll be local extremists. We don't like other people telling us what to do.
Well, and that brings up another point then. If ISIS got a foothold in there because of the no-fly zone, because of the failed state, And now that we're trying to side with different militias to defeat ISIS, are we not going to create the same thing that we did in Afghanistan?
Our goal is not to side with any militia. It is to help Libyans get together to form unified forces that are professional, impartial, neutral.
Is that possible, though? I'm
Yes,
going to go back to that.
yes, I think it's possible. Sometimes things that are hard are still possible. Just
agree.
because something is hard does not mean it is impossible.
No, I agree with that.
It was considered to be really hard to create a framework, political framework, in 2015 to try and bring the country together. Ultimately, we were able to work with other countries so that countries with very different takes and perspectives on the Libyan issue throughout the region, Middle Eastern region, and throughout North Africa, were able to say, yes, we agree this is the way forward, as well as Western European countries, the United States, and the permanent, the P5 on the UN Security Council. We had an awful lot of Libyans aboard, too. The goal now is to try and see if we can continue to get Libyans together to find further solutions to implement that long enough to then get a referendum on a constitution and elections in place so that you can have the country then move forward on that basis with unified national institutions. If the country winds up breaking up into pieces, it's going to be very bad for Libyans, and it's not going to be good for anybody else.
Do you see a strong person that could be elected in there that people would unify right now? Or do you see it still going through the struggling to somebody trying to vie for the power so that they are the person that can be elected? Or are they going to just kind of take the country over through force?
We do not believe that any Libyan can bring the country together through force. We just don't believe it. We look at it and say, is it possible? Conclude it's not going to work. It will bring other Libyans into play against it if anyone tries to do that. And our partners in working on Libya, international partners, pretty much conclude the same thing. It's going to be a process of getting there, promoting alignment, getting people to work with one another, preventing the breakup of the efforts to commandeer resources. That's the ongoing work. It's going to need to continue with some intensity for the foreseeable future.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ribble, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, I guess.
Yes, sir.
It's good to have you here. I want to go back to the economy, to some of the very early statements you made, because I think ultimately, I couldn't agree more with you when you talk about that these citizens want an economy that functions. They want families that are safe. They want their children to do well. They really want all the same things that families around the world want. Can you share with us in a little bit of your perspective of what the Libyan economy looked like under Gaddafi and what it looks like today? You talked a bit about oil, but what are the other economic drivers in the country? And then also talk to us about what those obstacles are. Are they religious? Is it a Sunni-Shia battle? Is it economic? Is it just disparate?
Yes, sir.
So just kind of take us through what you see the economics looking like.
Thank you for another great question. Gaddafi's strength and weakness was building the Libyan economy on oil and almost exclusively oil. There is essentially no revenue to the government meaningfully other than oil. There are small amounts from telecommunications, payments, that kind of thing, postal payments, some excise taxes, but it's basically oil. So when the price of oil is high, Libya under Gaddafi socked the money away. When the price of oil was lower, it managed. In the first days after the revolution, Libya continued to pump as much oil as it ever did. They started fighting with one another. Oil production went down. They then resolved things for a while. Oil production went up to where it had been pre-Gaddafi again. So the reason why oil is not being pumped at adequate level is political. It is not technical. It is not due to deterioration of the system, though Islamic State did damage some infrastructure that needs to be repaired, which would get it. So if they had a complete political agreement, maybe they could get up to 1.2 or 1.3 million barrels a day instead of 1.6. But they would be in excellent shape with that. So it's the failure to reach political agreement that is creating the problems. It's this pattern of extortion, holdups, people refusing to allow oil to be pumped for political reasons. That's what has to stop. It is a cancer threatening Libya's future when people shut down the oil. Then the money from the oil has to be distributed in ways that ordinary Libyans throughout the country say, our city, our town, our tribe, our people, our region are being taken care of. Gaddafi was good at that. He wasn't necessarily fair. He wouldn't have he didn't distribute it in the way that everybody else would have distributed it. But there was free education, there was low-cost health care, low-cost utilities. And so while there were haves and have-nots that were substantial, and that played a part in the revolution, I believe, he basically had his Gaddafi system down. Without him acting as the leader, that system is broken down, and you have these people shutting down the oil, which he never would have permitted. They need to get the oil pumped. There's no solution near term other than getting oil pumped so they can generate the revenues they need to then distribute it by political agreement. So what we're working on right now, in addition to urging Libyans to allow oil to be pumped, and right now there's 440,000 barrels a day that could be pumped from the west by a small number of people saying yes.
Is there an effective telecommunications system in the country where citizens can communicate easily through the internet and cell phones?
Yes, it's not as robust as it needs to be because there hasn't been investment in it in the last 5 years. And Islamic State at various times tried cutting the cords, as it were, shutting down elements of it, but it still exists. It could be stronger and needs to be stronger.
Because it's important for economically for the people to communicate.
But Libya needs to diversify beyond oil, but first it needs to turn the oil on, agree on budgets, agree on fiscal and monetary policy in light of current conditions, and reach further political agreements that would strengthen and build confidence among the Libyan people, thus shutting off the losses due to the parallel or black market. And we are working closely with the U.S. Department of Treasury and with Libyans in trying to promote their agreement on those issues, as well as with IMF and the World Bank.
One final question. In hindsight, and I recognize that hindsight's generally 20/20, what recommendation would you have for policymakers? What should the U.S. have done differently, if anything? Did we learn anything there?
As I mentioned before, and I'll repeat this core point, anytime that you're going into a country that's been run by a dictator, the aftermath could be very complicated because that's a particular type of system. And getting to a system that's more pluralistic and more representative, which is essential for countries to be sustainable. There's a reason why dictators fall. Eventually, their systems rot. And they no longer meet the needs of their people, and they can't maintain control. When you do that, you have to go in with humility, persistence, and commitment. You have to know a lot, listen a lot, be prepared to revise your initial thinking, consult with other people, and recognize that it can be a bunch of years. I worked on issues in the Americas in the 1990s and the Clinton years, and my rule of thumb used to be that after a civil war or the fall of a dictatorship or anything of that nature, and military or security forces becoming discredited, no longer being in place, you have to think about a decade for rebuilding. Not a year or 2 years, but a decade. That's not a very perfect rule, but it's order of magnitude what I've seen now over decades of being in this work. The other line I sometimes use is, don't try to do in Baghdad what you would never dare try to do in Baltimore, because you know it wouldn't work if you tried to do it in Baltimore. So I'll use the word again, humility. Governance is hard, and the further away you are from a society, the harder it is. You can still you can still help by being very attuned to a society and consulting and learning. But it is difficult, painstaking work that takes time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank the gentleman. We want to thank you, Mr. Weiner, for your testimony here this morning and now this afternoon. In my Democratic colleagues' defense, their absence is not due to a lack of interest, but they had leadership elections, which apparently went a little longer than they had anticipated. So their absence, of course, is excused. We want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you for your testimony. Members will have 5 legislative days to submit statements or questions or to extend their remarks. And if there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.